The axe handle he beat her with was carved by her father. A Lakota chief burned it in the fire. The thing I keep coming back to is the fire. Not the morning the handle came down on her, not the sound it made, and it made a sound. I want you to understand. The kind of sound that stays in the back of your skull for the rest of your life, not any of that. What I keep coming back to is 3 weeks after, just before dark, her father standing on the other side of a fire he'd built himself with his own hands, holding that hickory handle across both palms like he was taking its weight one last time, and then setting one end of it down into the coals. Not throwing it, setting it, like it mattered how it went in. I'm going to have to back way up. My name is Caleb Dross. I don't use the second name much. It was my father's, and my father and I didn't part on terms that make me want to carry his name around. Caleb's enough. I was 43 years old when I came to the Powder Creek camp, which puts this in the fall of 1872, and I want to be honest about what I was then. I was a man who'd been moving so long I'd lost the sense of what I was moving toward, if I'd ever had it. I'd left Missouri at 19 with $30 and an idea about California that had about as much to do with California as a man's dream has to do with the actual place. I'd ended up there, eventually. Worked the mother-lode country in the years just after the rush, when the easy surface gold was gone, and you needed a rocker and patience, and a tolerance for sleeping on cold ground. I had all of those things. I pulled enough out of the Sierra country to keep going, and then I pulled enough out of a bench claim up near Nevada City to buy a good horse, and then I worked my way north over 2 years, following rumor the way you do when you don't have anything better to follow. By 72, I was in the Northern Territories, working streams I can't all name now because they didn't have names that stuck. Men would call a creek by whoever was working it or whoever'd found color in it, and then the man would move on and the name would change, and in 10 years nobody would remember which creek was which. That's how it was up there. I'd had partners over the years, 3 of them at different times. The first one, heck, went home to Indiana in '61 and married a woman he'd been writing letters to for 2 years, a woman he probably didn't recognize when he finally met her in person. The second one, Tom, got sick of a kind that kept him in bed for 2 months and then killed him, and I was the only one there for the last of it, and I didn't know what to do with any of that, and I still don't think I handled it right. The third one, a man called Sprague, stole my horse in the spring of '70, and I never got the horse back, and I never worked with a partner after that. So I was alone. I was used to it. I had a system and a routine, and a way of getting through a camp without touching the edges of it too much, which is how a lone man survives in places where trust is scarce and men with too much whiskey and too little money can go sideways without a lot of warning. I want to tell you what I looked like then, so you understand what Winona was seeing when she finally looked at me. I was a man who'd worked outdoors in sun and wind and cold for more than 20 years. My hands were bad, the knuckles thick, the skin cracked in winter no matter what I did about it. My face had that leather look that some men get from long years in the elements, where the years stop marking themselves individually and the whole thing just looks like duration. My back had started giving me trouble the year before, a problem in the low back that flared up if I worked too long at the rocker without straightening. I had all my teeth except one molar, which was something I was privately pleased about. I was not the kind of man a woman looked at and thought, there's something worth pursuing. I'm telling you this so you understand the weight of what she saw. The Powder Creek camp sat in a valley between 2 ridges, the creek coming down from the north, and the camp had grown up along a 1/4 mile of its bank where the bench gravel was richest. 60 men, sometimes more. The supply operation was run by a man named Garza who was smarter than anyone gave him credit for, and not above extending credit to men he'd calculated would repay it. There was a cook tent that served 2 meals a day, breakfast, and an evening meal that was usually beans, and something else depending on what Garza had managed to lay in. There were 4 men who played cards every night in a linta near the cook tent, and you could tell what time it was by whether they were loud or quiet. I staked a claim on the East Fork, away from most of the noise. I'd found that the East Fork had a particular character of bottom, a mix of clay and gravel that in my experience sometimes held gold where pure gravel didn't, because the clay slowed the water in certain conditions and let the heavy stuff drop. The man who'd worked here before me, whose rotted rocker box I found in the brush, had not known this, or had known it and worked it out. I found his ghost placer pits in the bank and went to work downriver from them, where the material had compacted and not been touched. The first 2 weeks I was there, I pulled out about $30 in color, enough to buy supplies and keep me interested. The Lakota came to trade in my first week at the camp. They came in deliberately, without rushing, and they made no pretense of anything. They spread their goods on a blanket and they priced things with a steadiness that impressed me. They knew what things were worth and they didn't waver on it. Dried elk and deer, worked hides that were good quality, various medicines that some of the men bought out of need and some out of curiosity. They didn't overcharge and they didn't bargain from weakness. They traded like men who had other options. The older man, who I later learned was charging bear, stood back from the trading mostly. He let the younger men conduct it. He watched the camp. He was taking stock of things. I realized later, the way a careful man does when he's bringing his people into a space that isn't his and wants to know the exact nature of what he's working with. Most of the camp regarded them with a wariness that could have gone either direction. A few men were actively hostile in the way that some men were with anyone who wasn't exactly like them. Most were somewhere in the middle, neither hostile nor particularly welcoming, just doing the math. Winona came with the third or fourth trade party. I noticed her the way you notice something that doesn't fit, not because she was out of place exactly, but because she moved differently from the others. The men traded with a certain flatness, a watchfulness that came from dealing with people who might turn on you. She moved like someone who decided she had a right to be where she was, and that settled quality was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was that she wasn't trading, she was observing. She went through the camp slowly, looking at how things were arranged, how the men were working, the setup of the tents and tools and the cook operation. She was reading the place. She was maybe 30, possibly younger. She had her father's high forehead. I learned later he was her father, the older man who stood 2 steps back from the trading. And she had her own strong jaw and her own way of looking at a man that started at his eyes and worked outward, which was the opposite of how most men looked at her. Her name was Winona. Charging Bear noticed me watching her. He looked at me once from across the camp, a look that wasn't threatening and wasn't approving, just noting. I turned back to my work. There was an afternoon when she walked past my claim on the East Fork alone, and she stopped and looked at how I'd arranged the sluice setup. I kept working. After a minute she said, in English that was careful and deliberate, "You have set that wrong." I stopped. I said, "I beg your pardon." She pointed at the angle of the sluice run. She said, "The water comes around that bend. You want it coming straight in, not at this angle. You lose a third of the heavy material." I looked at my setup. She was absolutely right. I'd configured it the standard way without compensating for the particular curve of the bank. I said, "I'll move it." She watched me think about it, then she went on. I moved the sluice that afternoon. The next week my take was better than it had been since I'd arrived. I thought about her careful reading of the camp on those early visits and her precise reading of my angle, and I started to understand that she was a woman who saw what was actually there rather than what she expected to see. That's rarer than you'd think. Most people look at what they expect and see it, regardless of what's actually in front of them. Cord Pilcher. I've put off getting to Pilcher because he's the worst tasting part of this story, and I don't like spending time with him even in memory. But you need to understand what Pilcher was so you understand what the camp was, and what it meant that nobody in it moved when they should have. Pilcher had come to Powder Creek in early October, about 2 weeks before me. He'd been a drover, out of Texas originally, and before that something involving river transport that he mentioned once and then didn't mention again. He was big, not fat, just large, the kind of large that comes from years of hard physical work before it starts to go to waste. 40, maybe 45. He had a rope scar on his left palm and a way of displaying it that he probably didn't know was as obvious as it was. He drank from noon. Not fighting drunk, I want to be accurate about this, just a steady maintenance drinking that kept him in a particular zone, a zone where his desires became clearer to him and his regard for other people's preferences became hazier. In that zone, he was the kind of man who leaned on people, not usually violently. He leaned on them by taking up too much space, by standing too close, by asking for things in a tone that wasn't quite a request. He leaned on Garza about credit. He leaned on some of the younger men in camp about small things, use of tools, share of the cook tent. He leaned on people carefully, which told me he was intelligent about it. He knew where the lines were and he stayed just this side of them. With Winona, he didn't stay this side of anything. I watched it develop over the weeks she was coming to the camp. He started finding reasons to be near the trading blanket when she was there. He stood too close. He spoke to her in the half-joking, half-pressuring way that certain men think is charming and isn't. She ignored him with the economy of a woman who has ignored men like this her whole life, not acknowledging the behavior, not reacting, just continuing with what she was doing. Charging Bear saw it. He moved himself to a closer position at the trading blanket and Pilcher dialed back. But Charging Bear couldn't be everywhere, and Pilcher knew that. The morning it happened, I was checking a new section of bank on the lower East Fork, maybe 200 yards from the camp's center. I'd gone down with a flat pan to take some samples, the kind of quick read you do on new ground to see if there's any point in setting up there. It was a cold, dry morning in the middle of November, the sky pale and high, the creek running clear and low. I heard her voice before I heard anything else. I can't give you the exact words, I was too far away. I heard the tone, which was the tone of someone saying no to something clearly, without much room for misinterpretation. Then I heard Pilcher's voice louder, with an edge I recognized. Then something lower I couldn't make out. Then the sound. If you've heard an axe handle connect with a person, you know it makes a specific sound that is different from most sounds and that you don't get used to it. I heard it once and I was moving before I'd thought about moving. By the time I got there, she was on the ground. The first blow had caught her across the left forearm. She'd gotten her arm up, which was the right thing to do, and there was blood. Pilcher had both hands on the handle and was pulling back for the second swing. The flat pan I was carrying was cast iron, maybe 4 pounds. I swung it at the side of his head. Not the swing you'd use to kill a man, but close enough to it. He went down and he stayed down, and I stood there with the pan in my hand, and the blood behind his ear already matting his hair and Winona on the ground in front of me. I don't want to make this into something it wasn't. I was not thinking about being heroic. I was not thinking about anything. My body had moved before my mind caught up with the situation. If I'm honest, the only thing in my head in those 2 or 3 seconds was something close to rage, a specific, cold rage I've felt maybe 4 times in my life, and every time it's been in response to a man with a weapon and a person without one. That's not virtue. That's just a reflex I happen to have. I'm not saying it makes me a good man. I'm saying it made me the right man to be standing in that spot on that morning, and I'm still grateful for that, more than 50 years later. 15 men saw it. 15 men stood still. I helped Winona up and pressed a cloth from my coat pocket to the wound. She was shaking, not crying, not making a sound, just shaking the way a body does when it's been hit and hasn't decided yet what it's dealing with. After a moment, she put her own hand on the cloth and held it. She looked at me, not gratitude exactly, assessment, starting at my eyes and working outward, the same way she'd looked at men at the trading blanket. One of the camp men, Burchell, said from somewhere behind me, "Careful, friend. You just made yourself a problem." I looked at Burchell for a moment. I said, "Help her up." He didn't, so I helped her myself. Charging Bear came from the edge of the camp, and I braced for what I thought was coming. He was a tall man, and he moved fast when he moved, and he had the look of a man about to do something decisive. He stopped in front of his daughter. He looked at her arm, at the cloth on it, at Pilcher still face down in the mud, at me. He spent time on each thing. He spoke to Winona and Lakota. She answered him. He listened. He looked at me again, that still, tallying look I'd learned over months to read and never fully would. He was deciding something. I stayed still and let him decide it. He nodded once and spoke to Winona again, and then they were leaving, her moving with the careful gait of someone whose arm is sending bad signals. And I was left standing in the camp with Pilcher beginning to stir in the mud and 15 men finding things to look at that weren't me. Pilcher's headache lasted 3 days. I know this because I could hear him in his tent at night. The sound of a man with a serious headache is distinctive, a particular mix of misery and restrained fury. He came out on the 4th day and looked at me across the camp, and his eyes had that flat steadiness that means a man has decided something and is in no hurry about it. I loaded my rifle that night. I went asleep with it across my legs and woke up with it still there, and everything was where it was supposed to be. I did that every night for the 3 weeks until he left. The jar appeared on my flat rock on the morning of the 3rd day after the incident. I'd gone to the creek before sunrise, and when I came back it was there, small clay jar, wooden lid fitted tight, sealed at the edges with something dark. One of the cook's men told me later he'd seen her set it there early, before the sun was up. Inside was a dark paste that smelled like wood smoke and pine resin, and something green I couldn't identify. When I had a gash on my own hand the following week from a slipped chisel, I used it. Healed faster than anything I'd tried before. No infection. That was how it started. Not with talk, with a jar on a rock. The first real conversation I had with Winona was about 3 weeks after the incident, which puts it in mid-December. She'd come to the camp alone that morning, just her, no others, and she'd set something down at my tent, and I'd come back from the creek in time to see her leaving. I said, "Wait." She stopped, turned. I said, "Sit down if you want." She looked at me for a moment. Then she came back and sat on the log I had out front. I put coffee on. We sat for a while without talking. The camp was quiet around us. The cold was serious by then, the kind that makes everything still and blue in the morning, that makes your breath last longer in the air. I said, "You didn't have to come back here, after what happened." She said, "No." I said, "Most people wouldn't." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Most people have less reason to." I didn't fully understand what she meant then. I understand it now. She meant she'd been watching me before that morning, and the morning had confirmed something, not created it. I asked her about the paste. She explained what was in it, most of which I didn't recognize by name, but she described the plants well enough that I got the sense of them. She knew plants the way I knew ground, with specificity, without sentiment. I asked her where she'd learned it. She told me about her mother, who died some years before. She said it simply, without making much of it, but I noticed the pause between 2 sentences that were about her mother, the length of something being held and then let go. I told her about Tom, my second partner, who'd gotten sick and died slow, and that I'd been the only one there and hadn't known what to do with any of it. She listened without filling the silence. That was something I noticed. She could sit in silence without needing to put something in it. After a while she said, "You are an honest man." I said I tried to be. She said, "Most men here are pretending to be something. You are just being something. It's unusual." I didn't know what to say to that. I said I supposed I didn't have the energy for pretending. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. She stood up and she left. I sat there with my coffee and the cold morning, and that something at the corner of her mouth and felt, I'll admit, about 30 years younger than I was. The weeks in December were the slow accumulation of those mornings. She didn't come every day, maybe 3 times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, and I never knew in advance and learned not to plan around it. We talked about the ground, about her father, about the plants she used and where they grew. I told her about California, about the Sierra country, about working next to men who had large dreams and small attention spans. She told me about the seasons her people tracked, not 4 but many more, each with its own name and its own particular character. She was teaching me things. Not in the way of a teacher with a student, just talking about what she knew, the way you do when you're with someone who listens. I was listening. There was an afternoon in the 3rd week of December, the sky the particular pewter color that means snow soon. We were sitting outside, and she'd been explaining how her people read the depth of water running under the surface of ground, the signs of it in the vegetation, in the way certain grasses grew differently above a hidden current. This was useful to a placer miner, and I was paying close attention. Then she stopped. I waited. I'd learned her rhythm enough by then to know she stopped to make room for something, not because she'd run out of things to say. She said, "You are planning to leave in the spring." I said it depended on what the ground did. She said, "This ground will give in the spring. I know the places that haven't been worked. I can show you." I looked at her. I said, "That's generous." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I am going to be here in the spring." The way she said it was plain and direct and had no extra weight in it. She said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather. But there was something underneath it that was asking a question without asking. I said, "Then I'll stay." She looked at the ground for a moment. Then she looked at me with those clear, considering eyes. She said, "All right." That was the whole of it, but something in me knew what we'd agreed to. The snow came that night. Not the testing snow of early winter, but the committed snow, the kind that's serious about what it's doing. By morning there was a foot of it, and the camp was quiet in the way that only snow makes, every sound softened, the world reduced to what's close. I lay in my tent and thought about things I hadn't let myself think about in a long time, a place to be, a person to be near, the particular weight of choosing to stop moving. I'll be honest, it frightened me, not because I was afraid of her, because I was afraid of wanting something that clearly and not being equal to it. I'd learned over the years to want things carefully, the way you manage a fire in a wind, small enough that if it goes out, you're not left in the cold. But I understood already that this was the wrong approach to Winona. She was not the kind of thing you managed. I decided to be afraid and stay anyway. Charging Bear came to my camp on a morning in late January. He came alone, which I'd learned was unusual for him. He moved with people, either his own kin or the younger men who deferred to him. Alone meant this was a private thing. He sat on the log. I put coffee on. We sat for a while with the fire between us, the cold pressing in from all sides, the camp quiet. He said, "My daughter tells me she has chosen you." I held my cup in both hands and said, "She told me something like that, yes." He said, "Do you know why?" I thought about it properly. I said, "Because I didn't stand by when I should have moved. And because since then, I've tried to be the same man, when nobody's watching as I was when something needed doing." He was quiet. He looked at the fire for a while. Then he said, "A man who is different when watched than when not watched is a man nobody can trust." He looked at me. He said, "She watches, even when you think she doesn't." I said I figured that was probably right. He said, "She is strong. If you make her spend that strength keeping you upright, you will waste her. I have seen it done to strong women. It is a bad waste." I said I had no intention of that. He said, "Most men who do it have no intention either." It happens because the man is weak in ways he doesn't know about yet, and the woman is strong and she covers for him. And after a while she has spent so much covering that there is nothing left of what she had. He looked at me, he said, "Do you know your weaknesses?" That was not a question I'd been asked before. I sat with it. I said, "I know some of them. I'm sure there are more I haven't met yet." He almost smiled at that. He said, "That's the honest answer. A man who says he knows all of them is lying." He held his cup for a moment, looking at the fire. He said, "What I have watched in you these months, you don't waste effort. You don't take what isn't yours. You moved when you should have moved, and then you didn't make a performance out of it. You have been the same man in the cold, and the quiet, and the nothing as you were in that one moment." I said I didn't know, I was being watched that carefully. He said, "My daughter asked me to." I held that. He said she didn't tell me what she found. She made her own decision, but she asked me to look. He set his cup down. He said, "There is still the matter of what was done." He reached under his blanket and brought out the axe handle. I hadn't seen it since that morning. He'd had it, I don't know how or when he'd gotten it, whether he'd taken it from Pilcher's tent or someone in the camp had given it to him or what. But there it was, same handle. I recognized the worn spot near the upper grip. He said, "I am going to burn this." He said, "I want you to be there." I said, "Tell me when." He stood up. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it a moment, and then kept it. He walked away across the snow. 3 mornings later. He built the fire in the late afternoon, just before dark. He built it himself, in the open ground between the camp and the tree line where the trading blanket usually went. He built it carefully, the way a man builds a fire that means something not efficient but deliberate. Each piece of wood placed with attention. 2 young men from his group stood back at a distance. Winona stood near him. I stood across the fire. The light was going out of the sky. The cold was serious enough to feel like a weight. I could see my breath, and I could see Winona's, and I could see charging bears. And the fire was the warmest thing in the world at that moment, and I was grateful for it. He brought out the handle from under his blanket. He held it in both palms and he spoke. Low in Lakota, not looking at me or at Winona, looking at the handle at the fire. He spoke for 3 minutes or so. I didn't understand the words, and I wasn't meant to, not then. It wasn't for me. It was what needed to be said over the thing, and he said it. Then he set one end down into the coals. The way I described at the beginning, slow, deliberate, like the angle mattered. The wood caught from the end. Slow fire, working up the grain. He held it until he couldn't, and then he laid it on top of the coals and stepped back. We watched it. I don't know exactly when Winona moved. The fire was doing something to the light and to the silence both, and I was watching the handle burn because it seemed important to watch it. And then she was beside me, at my left side, her shoulder near my arm. After a moment, her hand came down and found mine where it hung at my side. I held her hand. It wasn't a gentle gesture. Her grip was firm and warm, and it just held, the way you hold a thing you've decided to hold. We stood like that and watched the handle burn down through its middle and collapse and take another 20 minutes to ash out. The cold was coming up from the ground through my boots. The fire popped and resettled. At some point, I heard the creak somewhere under the ice, and at some point, I heard horses in the trees, and the whole world was very particular and very exact, and very this moment and no other. Charging Bear looked at me across the fire when the ash was done. He nodded once. I nodded back. That was the ceremony. The spring came late that year, which springs up in that country often do. The snow didn't release until well into April, and when it did, it released everything at once and put the creek up for 2 weeks and made work impossible. Then the water dropped and the ground opened, and I went to work on the sections Winona had described to me over those December mornings, and she was right about every one of them. I want to say something about working ground that she had read correctly. Following lines that she'd told me to follow. There is a particular experience in that, being partnered with someone who knows things you don't, and trusting that knowledge and having it prove out. I'd worked alongside men for years, and the experience was never exactly that. With her it was. I built a second shelter in April, working alongside two of the other miners who traded their labor for some of Winona's medicine, which was in demand in the camp by then. The second shelter was bigger, proper jointed timber, a real floor, a real door. Not a cabin exactly, but a cabin's serious ambition. Pilcher had left in December, as I said. He claimed he was going south to find warmer ground. Nobody argued with him about that. The morning after he left, I realized I'd been sleeping with one ear open for weeks and hadn't fully known it. The first night after he was gone, I slept straight through until the cold woke me, which felt like a kind of reprieve I hadn't known I needed. The men who'd stood still that November morning were still in the camp, most of them, and they had the decency to be uncomfortable around me in a way that told me they knew what they'd done and what they hadn't done. I didn't hold it over them. What was done was done. A man stands still when he should move, and then he decides to be that man or he decides not to. It's not my business to adjudicate that for somebody else. Charging Bear's group came to trade in early May, when the mountain passes had cleared enough to travel. He came to my camp the morning they were leaving for their summer range. He came with Winona. He said in English, "My daughter will stay." He looked at her when he said it. She was looking at me. She had that quality I'd noticed the very first time she'd come into camp, the quality of someone who has decided she's allowed to be where she is. I said, "She's what this place needed." Charging Bear looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at his daughter. The look between them was 30 years of everything in it, all the ways she'd surprised him, and all the ways she'd been exactly what he expected, and everything in between. The look of a man releasing someone he loves into a life he trusts. He put his palm to her face once, and then he was going. Winona stood beside me until the sound of the horses faded into the trees to the north. Then she turned and looked at the camp, at the tent and the new shelter and the tools arranged on the east fork and the creek running high and clear. She was seeing what was there and what wasn't there yet. She was already working on the next things. She said, "That tent won't do for 2 people." I said, "No, it won't." She said, "You'll need to do better than that." I said I reckoned I would. She walked toward the tent with her hands on her hips in a way that was both practical and a little amused, already assessing the problem, and I stood where I was in the cold spring morning. I want to try to tell you what that moment was. The creek was loud with everything that had melted, and the camp around us was mostly quiet, and my boots were still damp from the morning, and she was walking toward that tent like she had things to do, and she was going to stay. I had spent 24 years looking at the next place. I was not looking at the next place. I was standing in this one, and it was enough. I want to tell you about Winona. Not the story of her, she's not mine to reduce to a story, but what she was in the life we built. She was not a woman who needed rescue. I want to be exact about this because the story gets told the wrong way sometimes, the man saves woman version. That's not it. She had survived 30 years on the frontier, the kind of 30 years that require more practical intelligence than most people use in a lifetime. She knew medicine, she knew ground, she knew weather, she knew people, she knew when to move and when to stay still. She was not lacking for any kind of competence. What she had done was choose. Every single step from the jar on the rock to standing at that fire to the morning she looked at my tent and said it wouldn't do, every one of those was a choice made by a woman with a full understanding of her own options and a precise read on the man she was choosing. She wasn't settling. She wasn't being practical. She was choosing this specific man for reasons that were hers, that she'd arrived at through her own observation and her own judgment. That is a different thing from being rescued. It is almost the opposite of it. Her father understood that. That's why he came to my camp in January and asked me those questions and watched my face while I answered. He was not checking whether I could protect her. He knew she didn't need me for that. He was checking whether I was someone her choice would be well placed in, whether I was the man who would honor what she'd seen fit to give. I have tried for 30-some years to be that man. Haven't always managed it perfectly. There were hard years, and I had my moments of being less than what she deserved, and she was honest with me about those moments in the way a strong woman is honest, not cruel, not softened to the point of dishonesty either. Just clear. Clarity is its own form of respect, and she gave it to me straight. She told me once, maybe 4 years into our time together, that the thing she decided in those weeks after the incident was that I was a man who would not need her to make him what he was. That she'd had enough experience of men who needed a woman's labor to hold themselves together. And it was a kind of labor that went unremarked and uncounted, and it eroded a woman over years, until she couldn't remember who she'd been before she started spending herself on that man's becoming. She said, "You were already what you were. I didn't have to make you anything." I said, "You've made me more careful about some things." She said, "That's different. That's just being in proximity to someone better." She said things like that, and she meant them plainly, without performance. That was one of the particular things about her. We built a proper cabin that first summer, just the two of us and what help I could trade for. I've built 3 since, each one better. The one we're in now has glass windows and a stone hearth that draws right, and she has a garden on the south side that in summer produces more than we need, which means we have things to trade and things to give away, and both of those are good things to have. Charging Bear came to us twice a year until the winter of '81. He'd sit at our fire. We had the proper stone hearth by then, and he and Winona would talk in Lakota for hours, and I'd be doing something with my hands in the same room, not understanding most of it but comfortable in it, the sound of it. He and I talked too, more as the years went on. He was a man whose conversation got better as you got into it, the way some terrain does, plain at the edges, and then something unexpected once you were in it far enough. He died in February of '81, which was a winter that killed older people and weaker animals and tested everything else. Winona went to be with him at the end, and I went with her, and I sat with the family in the way that was their way and not mine, and I tried to be useful and quiet and present. Her brother, a man I will not describe here because it's not his story, sat across from me on the last night and looked at me a long time. Then he nodded. I nodded back. The same nod. The same thing in it as the nod I'd exchanged with Charging Bear across a different fire a decade earlier. I understood by then what the nod meant. It meant, I see you, I trust you with this. The ride home took 2 days. On the second day, coming down out of the high country where the snow was still heavy, Winona rode beside me and didn't say much. I didn't say much either. There's a particular quiet between two people who have been through something together and don't need to process it out loud. She and I had both had enough of the other kind of quiet in our lives before we found each other. What we had riding down out of that country was the comfortable kind, the kind you earn. I asked her, maybe 2 years after that ride, about what her father had said when he burned the handle. I'd wondered for years. I'd decided it wasn't mine to ask until she chose to tell me. She was quiet for a moment, doing the thing I knew, making room for the next thing. She said, "He named what was done. He said the name of the man who did it and the name of his daughter who'd been wronged. He said the burning was the ending of that wrong's power to reach her. That the act had lived in the wood, and the wood would cease." She stopped. I waited. She said, "He also said something else." I waited. She said, "He said she had found a good man. He said let this fire also be the start of that." I got up and went to the window. The yard was dark and snow was falling, a patient snow, small. I stood there and looked at it for a while. She didn't say anything. She let me have the moment without putting anything on it. When I came back and sat down and looked at her, her clear eyes and the gray in her hair and the particular way she held herself, the way she'd always held herself, like someone who decided she was allowed to be where she was, I thought, this is what a good man earns. Not a prize, not something taken. Something given freely, by someone with the judgment to give it well. It's late now. The fire's been going down for an hour and I can't quite make myself move to add to it. Winona's asleep. She goes earlier than I do, always has. And the house is that particular quiet that a house is only when it's full of sleeping people, and the world outside is cold and settled. I've been a lot of places. I spent 15 years wandering before Powder Creek, and I can tell you the names of camps and the faces of men, and the lay of creek banks in a dozen territories, and the sound of water running under ice, and the particular quality of loneliness you get in a mining camp, where 60 men are all lonely in exactly the same direction, and none of them say so. I can also tell you what it is to have a woman look at you like you're the one she decided on. To have a man as careful and serious as Charging Bear watch you for 2 months, and then come sit at your fire, and tell you his daughter says she's chosen you, with a tone in it that says he's looked into it and found it might be right. I can tell you what it is to have someone put her hand in yours in the dark at the edge of a fire, not because she needed to hold on to something, but because she chose to hold on to you. You don't forget that. You don't waste it either. You wake up every morning and you do the work and you keep the fire and you remember what you've been trusted with and you try to be equal to it. The man across the fire who deserved that nod. The man the burning was the start of. Most mornings I think I manage it. The snow's coming down harder. I can hear it on the roof, which means it's heavier than it looks. There's a soft spot in the barn roof I've been meaning to fix since last winter, and this is the kind of night that punishes a man for putting things off. I'll get to it first thing. She'll wake up in the morning and look at me before she says anything, the way she always has. 30 years and that hasn't changed. Those clear eyes before the day started, before anything's been decided about the day, just looking. I'll be there. That's the whole of it.